A pleasure to me all at last, and welcome back once again to films I should have talked about years ago. Now this is something I've known for a long time, but it was only a little while ago that I had managed to watch it for the first time. And because I had in fact known about this film, it kind of made me wonder why I didn't watch it any sooner, but in any case though, Born to be Wild, not exactly in relation to the famous Steppenwolf song of the same name, is in fact an adventure film that settles on a not so well-behaved teenage boy whom unfortunately has to face a lot of consequences. He's had a lot of problems with his family, and the ties he's had with his mother were unfortunately a little blood boiling. Because as the opening scene of this film gives us, it's a unique car chase in which that unfortunately Will Horneff's character in this film, known as Rick, ends up getting apprehended by the cops. And as a result, they essentially want to try and put him in jail. Or at least in juvenile hall for what he's done, but they thankfully are able to come up with a different alternative. They're in fact able to get a wildlife specialist, a caretaker of a certain sign language speaking gorilla, to work together with Rick in the hopes that he'll shape up. And even though at first it does a pretty good job allowing for Rick to be more behaved and also more intrigued on the idea that a gorilla can even speak at all, let alone in sign language for him, there eventually comes a point in time in which that a circus owner had recently lost his gorilla, most likely for death. But little do Rick and this gorilla in particular know that this circus handler guy, he's a not so good person. But the thing is that the gorilla and Rick are in kind of a tight spot. Rick is supposed to be taking care of her, but she is unfortunately gonna be put in the hands of some abusive circus man. So, as a replacement for the recently deceased gorilla, which must have been the result of abuse from this owner as well, Rick comes up with a plan. He goes into the center late at night to bust the gorilla out. She and Rick decide to go away on a van and hopefully get as far away from the circus guy as possible. Eventually, when word gets out about the two missing, they end up going on a hunt after him. And as you might have guessed, the whole rest of this film is tied around this gorilla hopefully not ending up in the hands of some abusive man. Well, the thing is that whether you like it or not, adventure films like this are always unique to see. The idea, generally speaking, of a somewhat troubled teenager having to pretty much work around with some gorilla as punishment, eventually turning out to be a form of protection and care for the gorilla, in which that another person that comes around promises to do so, but once they find out about his true intentions, they just get as far away from him as possible. Now, I feel like that what could have happened is that Rick could have called 911, but I feel like that considering how troubled he was for some time, they probably wouldn't believe him in any case. He probably would need hard evidence as a means to try and situate these things out with the cops, but when you think about it, it gets pretty troubling on its own. Just the idea of carrying away property from some other person, that alone is pretty criminal. But in hindsight, Rick had a good mindset when it came to protecting this gorilla, the thing that he wasn't necessarily a fan of at first, from a not so good person. Well, as you probably will see later on in the film, if any of you guys have watched this film at all, there's a number of different scenes we could talk about here. We could talk about how it goes back and forth between the moments of Rick and the gorilla, and eventually points with other characters joining in as well. There also comes a point in which that they go to a restaurant, and there comes a pretty tense few moments in which that the gorilla almost gets spotted in a few times, a few disguises, and a few stealthy moves as it means to thankfully evade capture and or detection by authorities. But even with all of that covered, we might as well get to the real big story here. Because There eventually comes a point where the cops do find out where they're going to, and they are able to corner Rick, especially, but with the gorilla being able to get away, and of course with other people along to thankfully help them out, Rick is brought into court. And just as you might have guessed, this was pretty much the last straw, because it was already bad enough that he sped off away on some car in the start of the film and tried to get away from the cops that were chasing him, only to be captured at the last second. But in this instance, the judge is willing to really lay down the law on him until the gorilla shows up, along with some of Rick's new friends. They are able to convince the judge that the idea of this circus guy, whom is hoping to take the gorilla with him, was actually not going to end well for the gorilla. So the judge is pretty much swayed from the original idea of pressing massive charges against Rick. And overall, in spite of what he's done, the judge does basically give him a bit of a probation. A probation that, of course, allows for him to take care of the gorilla, but at the cost of him not being able to own a driver's license for a while. He essentially would have to reach the age of drinking and gunslinging in order to also be qualified for a driver's license. But in return, he has the ability to take care of the gorilla. The very same thing he was sworn to protect for some time now. Now, while this whole thing is rather simple for what it is, I especially like how the title went down. I mean, just the fact that we have ourselves a gorilla and a teenager on the road trying to get far away from some creep is really a unique way to create an adventure. The adventure between the wild and the civil, pretty much. Aligning for both worlds and bringing them together in a pretty nice way. So overall, what I will say is that for a 1995 film that's now 30 years old, I'm glad I went ahead and saw this for the first time. And it's probably the only time that I will be able to see it because, as you probably might have guessed, I have had a lot of other films worth talking about here. So I give Born to Be Wild a good 7.9 out of 10.1. Probably not the best of what it is, but it's a somewhat average film by then. But nowadays, I find this to be pretty good for what it is. Having a gorilla as part of the main cast, there's a number of different ways we could put it. Remember Ghostbusters? Well, Filmation's ones, not the Columbia ones from '84. And there was also the Three Stooges and the guy in an ape suit. There was King Kong. There was the Jungle Book. You know, King Louie. Well, in any case though, I've said enough for today's piece, but like I've said before, I'll be back soon with more films I should have talked about years ago. And in this instance, I will come back next time with something a little more recent. Until then, though, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.